Welcome to Regulatory Ramblings. Our podcast is brought to you by the University of Hong Kong's RegTech Lab, the HKU SCF FinTech Academy, the Asia Global Institute, and the HKU edX Professional Certificate in FinTech, with support from the university's Faculty of Law. I'm your host, Ajay Shamdasani. Today's episode will be devoted to discussing how American President Donald Trump's recent executive order instructing the U.S. Department of Justice not to enforce the decades-old Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, better known by its acronym, the FCPA, both in our region and the world more broadly. And in our initial spotlight section today, we'll be chatting with Philip Rohlik, an American attorney in Shanghai, to get a sense of what the president's actions mean for Hong Kong and our immediate vicinity. We'll follow that up with a lengthier discussion on the more global implications of President Trump's move with Malcolm Nance, a former naval intelligence officer, and Tom Fox, a veteran anti-corruption lawyer, compliance specialist, author, and podcaster. But first, three weeks after returning to the White House, President Trump signed an executive order on February 10th directing the Justice Department to pause prosecutions of Americans accused of bribing foreign government officials while trying to win or retain business in their countries. Trump's order pauses enforcement of the nearly half-centuries-old FCPA, and he directed his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, to review current and past actions related to the law and prepare new guidelines for enforcement. The law, enacted in 1977, prohibits companies that operate in the United States from bribing foreign officials. Over time, it's become a guiding force for how American businesses operate overseas. Quote, "It's going to mean a lot more business for America," Trump told reporters while signing the order in the Oval Office on February 10th. Interestingly enough, Trump wanted to strike down the FCPA during his first term, calling it a quote-unquote horrible law and claiming it made the U.S. the subject of the world's ridicule and derision. Yet, anti-corruption watchdog Transparency International said the FCPA made the U.S. a leader in addressing global corruption. Trump's executive order diminishes and could pave the way for completely eliminating the crown jewel in the U.S.'s fight against global corruption. Gary Kalman, executive director of Transparency International US, said in a statement. Last year, the Justice Department and the Securities and Exchange Commission filed 26 FCPA-related enforcement actions, and at least 31 companies were under investigation by year's end, a White House statement said. With us to discuss the regional implications of this is Philip Rohlik, an American attorney in Shanghai who is off counsel with the law firm of Debevoise and Plimpton in Shanghai. He's a member of the firm's white-collar and regulatory defense international dispute resolution groups, and his practice focuses on international investigation, securities law, and dispute resolution. He's recognized by the Legal 500 Asia-Pacific Greater China for his anti-corruption and compliance practice, and has been described as very thorough and hands-on, end quote, and a quote-unquote excellent investigations lawyer. Based in Asia since 2011, Mr. Rohlik leads the firm's dispute resolution team in Shanghai. He joins us from Hong Kong today. Philip, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Let's dive right into it. Preliminaries aside, what will this mean for the fight against bribery and corruption in Hong Kong, Greater China, and APAC more generally?
Well, I hate to say that it's a bit hard to say. I think in the short terms of the next 6 to 12 months, there will definitely be a reduction in enforcement activity. But beyond that, I think we have to wait and see for a variety of reasons. First of all, we have to think about what the executive order does do and it doesn't do. So it pauses new FCPA actions for 180 days at least, and it instructs the Attorney General to issue new guidance. And exactly what that guidance is will be important, and we won't know for 6 months at least. I think when it first happened, everyone thought that, well, everything is going to stop. But so far in the first case that has come up, which is a trial in New Jersey, it's an existing enforcement action, but the government decided not to pause it. And that's a trial of former executives of a U.S. company who were indicted for allegedly authorizing improper payments in India. So it's not something that focuses on foreigners. It's a case that involves Americans, but it has not been paused. So It's unclear exactly what will happen going forward. But it's important to remember the executive order does not change the law. So the legal responsibilities of companies subject to U.S. jurisdiction have not changed. It's also important to remember that the statute of limitations for the FCPA is 5 years for most offenses, and it's somewhat flexible as to when it starts running. So what companies do today will still be relevant and subject of enforcement authority after Mr. Trump's term ends in 2029. Both of those are things to consider. With that said, I think that there'll be less enforcement action in the APAC region and Greater China and everywhere. But it's important to remember that there are also other anti-corruption laws in the world.
In the political realm, words are an action. I just want to quickly read a quote from Francois Valerian, Chair of Transparency International, following up on comments his colleague made. Quote, he says, U.S. enforcement of the FCPA has long been the gold standard in the fight against corruption. Weaken it will empower wrongdoers and send a dangerous signal that bribery is back on the table. Foreign bribery is by no means, as suggested by last night's decision, a routine business practice. This is a betrayal of U.S. leadership in global anti-corruption efforts and a gift to those who profit from bribery and illicit financial flows. This dangerous course needs to be immediately reversed. I guess what I'm wondering is, I mean, clearly there's a certain look back period, so companies still need to abide by the rules as they are, because at some point President Trump will leave office. But if the U.S. is going to, sit this one out, so to speak, does that mean that if there's less FCPA enforcement or less rigorous FCPA enforcement, can we expect the UK Bribery Act to fill the void? But then again, or even the French have got their own statutes, but other countries lack the teeth. They lack the resources to make global enforcement a reality the way the US can.
I mean, I think that's true. The U.S. has been by far the most aggressive regulator in the bribery space. When the UK Bribery Act was passed in 2010, people thought that the UK would, join the U.S., but the UK authorities have not been particularly aggressive after the first few years in bringing cases. And partly, as you say, that's because of lack of resources, and I'm not sure that that's going to change. That said, anti-corruption enforcement is a growth industry. You mentioned France has been quite aggressive recently. Germany has historically been quite aggressive. And Brazil, although Brazil is mostly policing things that happen in Brazil, it is reaching out all over the world. It has been reaching out all over the world as part of the Lava Jato series of cases, which are probably over, but kept everyone busy for 10 years. I would say on top of that, India, Malaysia, and Australia in the past few years have all passed laws similar to UK Bribery Act. And of course, China has been aggressive in enforcing its own bribery laws, as has Vietnam.
The Glaxo case is still seared into our memory.
Well, the Glaxo case is still seared in our memory, and it's important to remember that, with the exception of India, these countries don't often go after foreign companies, but that doesn't mean they won't going forward. And so it's important to keep that in mind. And also, obviously, China has recently proposed an amendment to the anti-unfair competition law designed to reach offshore bribery. And even beyond countries, for infrastructure projects, the World Bank and multilateral development banks actually are quite active in policing corruption. They don't give big fines, but they do have disbarment. And in addition to all of that, a lot of companies have contractual commitments that require them to have anti-bribery compliance programs. So even if the U.S. sits it out, and it's not clear to me that the U.S. will be sitting it out, um, there are other regulators and other reasons why their anti-bribery and anti-corruption compliance and anti-bribery and anti-corruption enforcement will continue elsewhere.
So if one were a compliance officer, in-house general counsel at a bank or a major multinational corporation in Hong Kong or Singapore or Beijing or Mumbai, can they breathe a sigh of relief as long as President Trump is in office, or should they still remain fearful? What advice would you give them?
Well, I would say they should still remain fearful, but they should keep an eye on what's going on. So, the vast majority of FCPA cases involve wrongdoing by some local manager or local finance manager somewhere in Southeast Asia, um, or somewhere like that. Maybe with the willful blindness at headquarters, but usually it's like the local guys doing something that they shouldn't be doing. And I think if I was a compliance officer,
All too human tale.
yes. And if I was a compliance officer, I would those people have now read the newspaper and heard that the FCPA no longer applies. That's not actually true. And if I were a compliance officer, I would suggest to a business person to remind everyone about the company's anti-bribery compliance policies. Because if this pause is actually just a pause, then it's a problem if people start ignoring it, right? Because if you dismantle your compliance program or you let people just ignore it, it'll quickly decay and crumble, and then you're going to have to rebuild it from scratch. And I mentioned earlier, the Attorney General is assigned to come up with new guidance for the FCPA. And for more than a decade, many people who believe in the FCPA, and especially people like U.S. Chamber of Commerce, have been suggesting that there are reforms that could be made to the FCPA. And one of those, for example, is a compliance program defense, or what they call in the UK Bribery Act, adequate procedures defense, which doesn't exist in the FCPA. So if, to the extent that the Attorney General's new guidance are going to um, introduce things that a lot of people in the business community have been asking for to clarify the FCPA, one of those things would be a compliance program defense. And you wouldn't want to dismantle your compliance program in the 6 months before DOJ announces that. Now, I have no inside information about what DOJ is going to do or not, but it's something to keep in consideration that there are reforms to the FCPA that people have proposed in the past, and it's possible that DOJ could pick up on those. I do think that companies and compliance officers will adjust their behavior in terms of if sort of the saying, don't sweat the small stuff, right? So if a company was considering changing the rules about how much you can spend on a meal with a SOE employee, that is something that they'll consider, and the pause is something to be taken into consideration. And I think a lot of people will think about that, but more conservative companies will probably wait to see what the Attorney General's new guidance is. But it's also important to keep in mind that that's exactly the kind of thing that Chinese authorities and other authorities are cracking down on. So you have to take into account both the FCPA pause and other law. I also think it's an interesting question for companies if they want to be proactive, if your compliance officer wants to be proactive. One of the big ways that FCPA prosecutions start is through self-reporting, where a company goes to the government and says, here's what we found. It's not clear what's going on with that during the pause, because they've been instructed not to open new cases. So we don't know if the government will even pick up the phone if you tried to self-report. And sort of taking that off the table, at least temporarily, um, we think that companies should continue to take a look at whistleblower claims or wherever there's credible evidence of wrongdoing, and document that investigation. But there'll be less pressure in terms of do we need to self-report right now, because there's the pause and it's not clear anything's going to happen. And similarly, it can be an opportunity to do things like compliance audits or internal reviews, again, because you can do that and you can have more time to consider whether or not to self-report because of the pause. And I think those are things companies, that is something proactive that compliance officers can consider, um, uh, which is sort of improving compliance rather than taking your foot off the gas.
And also, as you were saying, using this time to do an audit also helps put a focus on the fact that it's not just an anti-bribery statute. The FCPA is a books and records statute.
It's a books and records statute, and let's face it, most of the controls, not all of them, but most FCPA controls overlap with anti-fraud controls. So if if you're finding a FCPA problem or a accounting problem, you could also be finding a fraud problem, which is something that exists regardless of how much the FCPA is being enforced.
Very much so. And to your point about reforms, perhaps including something along the lines of a compliance program defense, as you would have with the UK Bribery Act, because otherwise it's strict liability with the UK Bribery Act. It's interesting the number of former U.S. attorneys general, Mukasey, Alberto Gonzalez, and some of their deputies that have come forward and testified before Congress that the FCPA needs such a defense. Now, the DOJ for the longest time has said no. Others have pointed to the distinction between the FCPA, which is a pretty decent, well-meaning statute, versus FCPA Inc., which is the whole cottage industry, which has grown around all these enforcement actions and the defense lawyers that seem to have made a healthy living off of that. That's been pointed out to as well, which brings me to my next point, which is the FCPA is still a powerful tool. It's a very potent arrow in the quiver of the Department of Justice. Given the vindictive and transactional nature of the current president, can we not expect selective enforcement of the act under his administration? For example, you know, if say a particular country is giving the U.S. grief in trade negotiations, bring FCPA charges against one of their companies operating in the U.S. And okay, you let our Harley Davidson bikes in or Tennessee whiskey in, and we'll make these charges go away. I mean, it's not inconceivable that these could be used in a politically motivated way.
Well, I think okay. I think there are different ways to look at it. Obviously, it's not inconceivable that anything could be used in a politically motivated way, and some of the reasons given for the pause, and at the time the executive order was issued, was the belief that Trump has that the FCPA puts U.S. companies at a disadvantage. So, in that sense, it's not crazy to assume that foreign companies are more likely to be targets. And it's the possibility of that is a good reason for foreign companies to improve their internal controls in this area. But I think there are three things to consider about how much that will be a practical effect, in the sense that in the first case, most FCPA cases, and it varies little depending on the year, but most big FCPA settlements already involve foreign companies. And foreign companies have been complaining about that for quite a while. And it's potentially one of the reasons that US businesses are generally support the law. Second, uh, almost all FCPA cases arise from either self-reporting, tips from competitors or whistleblowers, or information learned from foreign press or foreign regulators. And that's not going to change. So it's hard to create a case out of thin air. So the types of things that come to the Justice Department's attention are unlikely to change in any case. And although regulators and the DOJ have a lot of discretion to open an investigation, there are ethical duties when it comes to bringing prosecutions. So I'm not sure how much in practice will change. For instance, you could say, well, we can expect the U.S. regulators to be more aggressive when it comes to asserting jurisdiction over foreign companies for foreign conduct in the FCPA space, but they're already really aggressive. They could get a little more aggressive, but how much more aggressive is not clear. So it's hard for me to say that, I think that DOJ will be vindictive or anything like that. I do think that, the stated priorities of the administration come from two sources which aren't exactly the same. So 5 days before the executive order, Attorney General Bondi issued a memo instructing prosecutors to focus FCPA prosecutions on drug cartels and transnational criminal organizations. And it seems to me that would suggest more of a focus on Latin America. But at the same time, in the announcement that accompanied the executive order, President Trump said that he thought the FCPA put U.S. companies at a disadvantage in areas such as critical minerals, deep water ports, and other key infrastructure assets. And those are the types of things where the U.S. tends to be competing with China. So you have, different parts of the administration saying different things. And I think it's too early to tell exactly what they will do. But it's important to remember that in the last Trump administration, there was this thing called the China Initiative, which did lead to a lot of different kinds of cases related to China, but didn't really lead to FCPA cases not related to Chinese companies, in part because of jurisdictional difficulties. So I wouldn't panic about inconsistent application of the law just yet.
But I mean, in terms of, I mean, I'm sure your client's aware of developments. What are they telling you? What are their concerns? What are their potential worries?
Everyone is still trying to figure out exactly what this portends, right? So when Trump issued the executive order, people thought, okay, well, not the DOJ is not going to do anything. But as I mentioned, the DOJ is continuing with a trial in New Jersey. And so, when the executive order was initially issued, the judge in that case asked the government, so what does that mean? And they said, we don't know, we'll get back to you. And then eventually they did get back to him and they said, well, we're going forward with the trial. So, there is a question about what the executive order means. Does it mean that there'll be a 180-day pause and then things will continue not completely as they were before, but, in a somewhat different way than they were before? Or does it mean a sea change in FCPA enforcement for the rest of Mr. Trump's term? Mr. Trump has issued, I think, over 60 executive orders so far, probably more. And so there's a bit of a question about how much attention he can give to how much attention the administration can give to each one. So I think most clients are in a wait and see, have a wait and see attitude, because it could make their business life easier or it could make it harder, because obviously no client wants to be in the situation where everyone approaches them with their hand out asking for something.
Fair enough. Philip Rohlik, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Welcome back. We're now going to look at some of the more global, macro level effects of President Trump's recent executive order on not enforcing the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. With us to discuss the matter are two gentlemen who really need no introduction, Malcolm Nance and Tom Fox. Malcolm joins us from upstate New York. He was a 20-year veteran of the U.S. Navy, where he was an intelligence officer, cryptographer, Russian and Arabic language linguist, and in his capacity as a Master Chief, he was responsible for discipline throughout the ranks. He's best known for his appearances on MSNBC, where he warned about Russian interference in the run-up to the 2016 and 2020 U.S. presidential elections. Malcolm is also a best-selling author, with his books The Plot to Hack America, The Plot to Destroy Democracy, The Plot to Betray America, and most recently, They Want to Kill Americans. Well worth reading. Joining Malcolm is Tom Fox, a prominent member of the compliance community and one of the most well-known legal practitioners when it comes to the FCPA. He was certainly someone I would go to with my queries about bribery, fraud, and corruption back when I was a Thomson Reuters correspondent at the Financial Crime Beat. Over the past 15 years, he's been a general counsel and chief compliance officer. He's now an independent consultant assisting companies with anti-corruption and anti-bribery compliance and international transaction issues. Tom's also the author of the award-winning FCPA Compliance and Ethics blog and the international best-selling book, Lessons Learned on Compliance and Ethics. In the interest of full disclosure, Tom is also the founder of the Compliance Podcast Network, which also carries this program. And with that, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's really my pleasure. And Tom, this is Malcolm. I'm so glad to be here with you. I've got my notebook out. Because we're talking compliance. I'm going to hear every word you say, and I'm going to steal it.
Well, thank you,
Terrific.
Ajay. I'm not sure you know my origin story for my compliance career, but it started with a bicycle incident where the final score was Hummer 1, Tom 0. So I feel your pain.
Yeah, the painkillers help, but yeah, it helps take the edge off. But that's nothing compared to the pain the world is feeling right now. And I guess what I'm wondering is, what were for both of you, what were your visceral impressions when you heard the news that Trump had issued an executive order instructing the DOJ not to enforce the FCPA?
Well, mine was what took him so long. We all knew he'd do something. I thought he would just try to have the law revoked, but I guess he figured he couldn't do that. So I was not surprised at all.
Malcolm?
Yeah, I come from a completely different perspective here as a field intelligence collector for most of my career. So I've been on the ground in the Middle East, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, where I saw a lot of bribery on a very large scale, up front and personal. I mean, you couldn't drive, you couldn't move around Nigeria without having a you know, little petit bois money waiting around. But this is an order of magnitude. I know Trump dabbled in this in the first Trump administration. He had talked about loosening up compliance with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And I believe the statement that he made was that the U.S. businesses were being denied opportunities that other businesses were getting, principally because they were not, greasing the palms of people on an enormous scale and making them, making people give them favors, make the paperwork go faster, as we all know in certain parts of the world, getting their, the 13 stamps that you need on whatever document that you need. And he felt that there was a disadvantage to U.S. Companies. But when I wrote my book prior to this, the latest, Plot to Betray America, it became very clear that he fully intended to sell the American presidency, and that it was not just for the benefit of himself, but his allies. And he viewed that America was a sucker for not being on the ground around the world and greasing the palms and, doing what, Chinese business were doing, Russian business then were doing, which was out corrupting the next guy. And so when the first visit that he made to Saudi Arabia, I was quite shocked. I'm a Middle East specialist, and I realized at that meeting that the Saudis found the president that they were looking for, an American president who could be purchased. And no other president before them had done that. So for him to come up this time, as Tom said, and just, you know, rule that it should be done, that was not surprising. That he's just so blatant about it, and it's like Scrooge McDuck throwing gold coins in the air. He and his allies will swim in the corruption and think it's good for us.
For him to acknowledge, okay, U.S. businesses are being hurt. I mean, he's acknowledging that type of corruption is part and parcel of business in other parts of the world. That doesn't mean one should necessarily want to make it the standard for American companies doing business overseas, because if America fails to maintain standards, I mean, this sounds naive, but then who does the rest of the world have to look up to? Who maintains standards? Whose standards are we going to adhere to? If not America's standards, then does that not suggest that there's going to be a void, a lacuna, that there's going to be no standards, at least for a time?
I don't think so, because if this had happened 15 years ago, perhaps. But remember, in 2010, we had the UK Bribery Act became live. We've had France, Germany, Spain, Brazil, all pass robust, internationally focused anti-corruption laws. So the void you spoke of, I think, could well be taken up by other countries, particularly if the politics of this or the political situation degenerates as it I'm sure it will. We have regimes of anti-corruption laws literally across this country, across the globe. And for American companies, I think it's going to be an unmitigated disaster for two reasons. One, the FCPA protected U.S. companies from being required to pay bribes because they could say, as Rex Tillerson did to President Trump in the first administration, he said, when I was at Exxon, we didn't pay bribes because we didn't violate the law. And if you can say that with conviction, that's of some protection to you for being extorted to pay bribes. The second thing is there is no country in the world that allows or has a law which says you may bribe our government officials. Now, as Malcolm said, on the ground, things can be different, but there's no law that says that. So that means that in every country in the world, there's a domestic anti-corruption or anti-bribery law. And if those countries choose to enforce those laws, any U.S. citizen, any U.S. business, any U.S. corporation is subject to being fined, penalized, or brought to criminal trial. And many of those places are not going to be friendly to Americans if they're arrested.
No, good point. But I was just thinking, it's all well and good for the Europeans to have their statutes. The UK Bribery Act has certainly made an impression, and there have been prosecutions under it in that time. But it seems to me the issue of teeth, the issue of deterrent, the issue of resources to back it up, which the U.S. has, that it can put muscle behind its transnational enforcement goals in a way others can't.
Well, I think the other part of the equation is that starting in 2010, the United States Department of Justice and Securities and Exchange Commission made a very large, loud, and wide-ranging push to educate prosecutors in other countries on investigative and prosecutorial techniques for bribery and corruption. And literally across the globe, the U.S. had events in Washington where they did training. They also did roadshows internationally where they did training. And there is now a cadre of anti-corruption prosecutors literally across the world. And I'm of the opinion that they have the resources to bring domestic corruption cases in their own countries should they choose to do so.
There is a fear amongst some that for those businesses that have no scruples, that Trump has essentially given them a green light to say, do as you will in the developing world.
You know, from a practical perspective, Tom hit on this across a strategic arc between, you know, the poles of the world, who's going to comply, who's not going to comply. But from a practical perspective, this is going to cost U.S. businesses a whole lot of money. You know, if you have the previous attorney general saying that that they just don't carry out bribery, they just don't carry out corruption. Well, now they'll be forced to, and almost forced by the president of the United States, who, if he, you know, defangs his Justice Department, his Commerce Department, and banks from having to be concerned about this, corporations are going to have to put money under the table, which means that's going to come out of their bottom line. They're going to have what? Special, you know, gold vault slush funds, you know, to beat out, you know, to win contracts, bids, and awards beyond what's going on out there at the moment. I mean, I lived in the United Arab Emirates for 10 years, and for a very long time, they were enforcing, you know, these laws and compliance on a very broad scale there. But now, if you're talking about doing business in Burundi or going to Ecuador or some other place like that, there will be an expectation that you will give us money. and and that amount will grow and grow and grow and grow, and whoever the highest bidder will get the work. And that level of corruption sets us back, all the way back to the Stone Ages, I believe.
Let me pick up on that cost part.
Yes, Tom.
Because it's not, well, it can be a one-time cost. It can be $10,000, $50,000, $100,000 for a contract or a series of contracts. But many who extort are much more sophisticated than that. And as with all criminal enterprises, once they are in your pocket, they don't go away because they know they have you. So they can come back for more. They can come back when you're due a payment. They can come back when you're trying to get your money out of their country. There's a number of times they can continue to extort money out of you, or in a much more sophisticated bribery scheme, they get a piece of the action. Contract's worth $2 billion, they get 10%. They get it on a quarterly basis, written right into the bribery agreement. So the cost to U.S. companies will be an ongoing surcharge or tax. But once they get back to the U.S., those companies have to record and report that, because if they don't, that also violates a part of the FCPA. And that really brings up one of the things I want to emphasize here. The FCPA has not been repealed. It is still the law of the land in the United States. And there's a 5-year statute for the criminal sanctions of paying a bribe. But the part the SEC regulates, which is the books and records and internal controls, that's a 6-year statute. So even if you started paying a bribe March 1, you've got 5 years that the government can prosecute you. And if there's a change in administration in 2025, you can rest assured that those companies will be investigated and prosecuted by another administration. So U.S. companies are really taking a lot into their hands to set up slush funds to pay these bribes, because you either go full Siemens or Odebrecht with the Department of Bribery and Corruption, with the executive VP in charge of it, which those companies set up whole business units to pay bribes, or you do a small cadre who are in on the bribes, and they have to figure a way to steal the money from the corporation to fund the bribe. And that's the difference in bribery and fraud. In fraud, employees steal money from the corporation and keep it. Well, in bribery, they steal money from the corporation and pay it to someone else. So it's still going to be illegal going forward.
What concerns me, Tom, is, I mean, as you're aware, under the 1988 amendments, payments to expedite a matter are permitted. I can't help but feel as though they're going to play fast and loose with the rules and say, yeah, they'll disclose it on their on their filings in the U.S. and they'll just mark it as this was done in order to expedite whichever transaction or whichever matter. And with this Justice Department, do you really think they're going to scrutinize it that much?
This Justice Department, no, but another Justice Department certainly will do that. And then you've got it in the books and records, and either it's accurate or it's not. So U.S. companies are really putting themselves in a very dangerous position to affirmatively violate a law on the books, even if the president has suspended enforcement.
There's another facet to this, is that the Trump White House, in its first term, set the pace for petty corruption stemming straight out of the White House. I mean, the Trump Hotel at the National Postal Center, in which the hundreds and hundreds of rooms were purchased and never occupied by very big players, allowing his nepotistic children to take money for slush funds and all these other things. And again, and allowing people around him has now given this stench that now in the second term, That's, all safeguards have gone out the window. So if you have a president of the United States that's doing this right in the face of the American public by establishing a Justice Department and other, and who will go there and literally bring a wrench to remove all the safeguards, then, the world will see the United States as inherently corrupt. And the question on the table for corporations is, do I want to be clean? Do I want to be the knight in shining armor who's essentially the corporate version of of Mr. Clean, uh and lose an advantage and maybe even be ridiculed or by people who have curried favor with this White House, and you may lose something of value by not going out and paying your baksheesh, dear balik, petit pois, whatever you want to call it, on a multinational scale. On the other hand, I personally think, again, I come from the streets, right? So I had an incident where I was in Iraq. I was working for a major U.S. corporation, and we had to purchase something in cash to the tune of $2 million. And immediately, as soon as the deal was done, they tried to hand me $100,000 in cash. And they go, that's your 10%, that's your 5%. You have to take this. And I was like, no, I absolutely will not. And I established a reputation at that point that I was unbribable. And even though people thought, well, you're crazy American, it actually helped us all the time that this guy cannot be taken for a ride. This guy will always be straight.
Right, that you were beyond reproach.
Right. But if you do that on a corporate level, you're not Walmart, you're Rolex. And perhaps, you may lose market share, you may lose some influence. But if you're playing within the parameters of those rules, you're not seen as dirty. And if they do see you as a sucker, well, you're at some point, people of quality are going to see you as far better partner to work with.
Malcolm, your point's well taken, but it just seems to me that in an environment like that, if companies are getting the message that it's why even bother being clean when the most powerful man on earth is saying, don't be, follow your interests as you see fit. I mean, as warped as it sounds, the US seems to be saying a third world standard is okay for American businesses.
Well, it's not the U.S. that's saying that. You have to limit it to Donald Trump saying that. But there's really a second part to this executive order that merits some consideration. And that second part says that there will be a 6 to 12 month review of FCPA enforcement, which gets me moved. Actually, I want to use that to get to my next point, which is I think there's a grave danger that the U.S. administration will start to use to weaponize FCPA and weaponize it against companies from countries that Trump deems to be antithetical to his interests. And if that starts happening, then other countries that have robust anti-corruption laws may take the same position, and that we could have this sort of weaponized anti-corruption enforcement going on across the globe. So we don't know what the Department of Justice is going to say. Trump has suspended enforcement pending this review. So some other information may come out. Probably it'll take a year, as that way they don't have to do anything. But there is something that may come out of this on the far end that we may be talking about in 6 to 12 months.
Given the vindictive and transactional nature of this president, it seems as though selective enforcement of the FCPA under his administration is almost inevitable. It's like, Mr. Modi, you're not going to let Harley Davidson into your country without tariffs? Well, I'm going to bring charges against X, Y, and Z companies, and it's not inconceivable that's what he's going to do.
There's a word in the economic intelligence world for what you just described, and that's called extortion. And this is we're literally are discussing the possibility that a corrupt president will essentially act in Al Capone-like fashion of using a corrupt law enforcement mechanism in force in order to bash down his competitors. And, having lived in the third world for a very good part of my life, I know how that's going to operate. People are going to start putting gold bars, right, on the table. And and as that corruption continues, it's not going to be, okay, you've got your factory and you've got your money put into the sovereign wealth fund. Every person up and down that chain is going to start asking for more. And if Americans get a taste of that, then it Katie bar the door. That especially in an administration that sees law enforcement as the cudgel to beat its political enemies and has no investigative oversight because the president himself is a king, according to the Supreme Court, and anything he does that is an official act is lawful.
Tom?
I think Malcolm is right, but let me turn to an example of a country which has a robust domestic anti-corruption law and has used it against a Western company. I would point our listeners to China with GlaxoSmithKline in 2012, 13, and 14, where the company was prosecuted in China, fined $500 million for bribing Chinese hospital officials, basically, but officials in the medical care or medical industry. And they criminally convicted the GSK country manager and all of his direct reports. Now, they had their sentences not commuted, but they served terms in prison or in home arrest in countries outside of China. But the precedent is there. If a U.S. company engages in that type of action, or a British company, or you name the country, engages in that type of activity in a country like China, which does have the wherewithal to prosecute, which has a very good success rate for its prosecutors, and who has a robust domestic corruption law, you could easily see Western business people being caught up in that. And that's perhaps the thing that scares me the most about potential American businesses or American business people is that security issue. So if you do this, it's not have your eyes wide open because Trump said you can do anything. It's you better watch yourself very, very carefully.
I find it fascinating that China could jump in here as the adult in the room. And considering, how fast and loose a lot of things occur on that side of the world, that they could make it a governmental policy to step up and fill the role for the United States and reshape the global corruption war, so to speak. And of course, they themselves having such a broad base of economic power now in parts of the world, the United States seems quite ready to give up. They themselves could be playing hardball with us against rules that we were the enforcers for just 60 days ago.
I think that's very possible.
That would be ironic that China becomes the white knight in global anti-graft. But yeah, I mean, it's long been said about American and European businesses, but more so the Europeans, that they may be squeaky clean back home. And I'd say this even with Hong Kong and Singaporean businesses. They may be squeaky clean at home, relatively speaking. But in the third world, in the developing world, out of sight, out of mind, no one's looking, that's where they go wild. And, for the longest time, the FCPA at least invoked some degree of dread because it was often easy to find some kind of U.S. nexus. And so that kept people in check. But it just, Trump's actions have a lot of people spooked. And as I mentioned before, that in legal and compliance circles here locally in Hong Kong, people have been speaking about it ever since. And so I guess I'm wondering is, if you were advising an in-house lawyer or a compliance officer at a multinational corporation or a bank or a financial institution, what would be the tone and the tenor of the advice you give them?
Well, and I have been talking to compliance officers, so let me split it into compliance officers and non-compliance officers. For compliance officers, the message I want them to hear as loudly as I can say it is up your game. Up your game now. You are going to have to go to your senior management and have the kind of conversation we've had on this webinar. And you're going to be asked some very pointed questions along the lines of, we don't have to worry about this. Why do we have to pay you and your team? You have to be prepared to answer that question, and you have to be prepared to explain why a company which runs its business in compliance is not simply a better run company, but you're not going to incur these expenses and potential risks. And actually doing a business in compliance is better for the bottom line because you don't have this hidden tax of 10 or 20% on your contracts outside the United States, or at least in certain countries that are the well-known suspects. If I'm talking to other senior executives, I say, if you do this, you are subjecting yourself to potential fines and penalties and criminal sanctions under the FCPA for 5 years, or in the countries where you do this, you're potentially subjecting yourself. And so the risk to you, if you create a Department of Bribery and Corruption, and if you either do this or bury your head in the sand with a comment like, who will rid me of this meddlesome priest, then you subject yourself to personal liability. So those are the two types of conversations or counseling that I'm giving right now, Ajay.
Malcolm, I mean, you have a very different perspective on this, given that you're on the ground. You've seen that sometimes palms need to be greased, but by the same token, you've managed to walk your path and do it your way. What advice would you give then people that in environments where people have no incentive to change systems, ecosystems, organizations, businesses, that societies that are dirty and like being dirty, and you're not going to change them in those instances? Do you go along to get get your work done, or do you do you end up as the outlier, as the holdout?
I think it's a question of scale. I mean, there are just places where, I mean, I've been around the world. I'm an American, which is essentially a walking, talking ATM for many people. And there is a big difference, an order of magnitude difference between, a couple of soldiers on the street corner who want, a Coke or need to get a little food, extra food from their family. And whereas within its own culture, the culture will have to change that. I cannot change that. That's different from being Mr. 20%, right? Where every transaction must give 20%. It's not only
Yeah, I gotta get my cut.
yeah, I got to get my cut, and I will hurt you if I don't come down to it. I had a client recently, did not ask my advice. Okay, this is always bad. Whenever if you've got a professional former spy around, please ask their advice, because we won't lie to you. And this client went to a sub-Saharan African country. They thought that they were being given preferential treatment on defense contracts. They met with ministers, they met with individuals. Everyone promised them this contract. And I found out about it until at the last moment, And my unsolicited advice was, this is a chain scam that is being carried out because they know you're not smart enough to play it like a real American, which is, sorry, we have to do it within our laws. They lost $3 million in a single payout because they thought they were going to play it like the locals. The locals played them. They brought in real ministers to scam these people. Don't play the game. I think that being clean where you can be clean at a corporate level, at the macro level, be the Rolex. Don't be, a sundial made out of a stick and camel dung. Do the game as cleanly as possible, and if you maintain that compliance, and be the people that they talk about as being unassailable, as being unbribable. And I think that'll give you a measure of respect that other corporations will mock you, but you will actually gradually, move back up when they need people they can rely on.
I guess it all comes down to those Transparency International lists. And my God, I mean, the way places like Hong Kong and Singapore, especially Singapore, throw a hissy fit when they slip in the rankings. Because for them, their position in Asia, their much vaunted position in the region, largely stems from how relatively clean they are compared to the countries in their immediate vicinity.
Ajay, let me just say Malcolm's answer was as fine an answer as I have ever heard for the business reasons for doing business ethically and compliance. He didn't mention the FCPA. He just said, you protect yourself, you protect your company, and people want to do business with you because you've comported yourself in that way. Or conversely, they won't lean on you for a bribe.
If only more people would encapsulate that in their codes of conduct. And any closing thoughts, gentlemen?
I will just say to any compliance professional listening out there, your job is more important than ever now. Your management may think they get a free pass, but they're not. And whatever you do, you need to educate them to the risks that still exist, but the opportunity for you as a compliance professional to literally up your game, show management that you can, as a team, manage any risk they put in front of you through the process you use to manage compliance risks. I think compliance can become more embedded and more ingrained in business process and be seen not as a partner of business, but just as business.
Let me take it from a higher altitude level. No matter what's going on in the United States, I think people who are overseas need to understand something. We change government every 2 years. We change executive leadership every 4 years. So if this may look like, the golden age of shaking down American corporations, you may find an intensely hostile next administration in 2026 who are carrying out enormous investigations and who could rip your entire corporate reputation apart. If there's a new president from the opposite side, there's going to be a backlash to all of this. So better to, as I like to say, walk between the raindrops, and do your compliance dance as best as you can. And that way you're not caught up in any shenanigans that will end up in a history book.
Well put, Malcolm. I think it was President Obama who said there are no permanent defeats or successes in American political life. So with that, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, it's really
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you all. Until next time.